Hello and a very warm welcome to the channel. Now regular viewers, both of you, will know I created this channel for two reasons. The first is to explore my fascination with American culture, and the second is my obsession with history. I mean, arguably those should be two separate channels, but I don't have the intellectual bandwidth to maintain two YouTube channels, so for the moment they're going to stay as one. Now I've done quite a bit on America recently, so I thought it was time to address the balance somewhat and do some more history. There's a really interesting looking video I saw called World War II Every Day with Army Sizes. It's got something like 10 or 11 million views, which is crazy considering it just went up. So I definitely think there's something worth watching here. So yeah, we will watch said video. Oh, it's from a channel called Christopher, by the way, which I've never dealt with before. But I think it's fantastic that someone just calls their channel Christopher. Like, I'm going to start a history channel. What am I going to call it? I'll just call it my name. Why not? Yeah, nice and simple. So yeah, no, go subscribe to Christopher because their somewhat ambiguous name is very appealing to me. Right, so this is, I say, obviously about World War II. I think it's going to be really interesting. We will obviously see, and let's play the video. Right, so we're starting with the Nazi invasion of Poland. Almost immediately, France and Britain declared war on Germany in response. But as you can see from this map, they did almost nothing immediately beyond that. They kind of just sat behind the Maginot Line and defended themselves. And there is, even to this day, quite a lot of bitterness in Poland that the Western Allies didn't do more. It was called the phony war in the West. And you can kind of understand why.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German...
Right, so here we got the Soviets joining the invasion. So there was a kind of secret, no, it wasn't a secret alliance, it was an open alliance between the Nazis and Soviets, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which for the Western Allies was just a complete disaster. I mean, both the kind of liberals and conservatives and moderate socialists in Britain and France were both terrified of the Nazis generally and terrified of the Soviets, but they always kind of assumed they would counter each other out to some extent because they were so ideologically opposed. And suddenly when these two rival superpowers made an alliance, it was a terrifying moment for the powers of liberal Western Europe. And as you can see, the Soviets actually waited a couple of weeks before they joined the invasion of Poland. That was probably due to Stalin being quite paranoid, being concerned about how the war would go. It was only when it was very clear that Poland was going to get decisively defeated. I mean, it's worth remembering that in about 1921, the Soviets did invade Poland as well, following the Russian Revolution, and they were decisively repulsed. So, I mean, clearly they had experience of the Poles not to underestimate them, basically.
German government, the final note.
Oh, and this speech is a very famous speech. It is Neville Chamberlain, who was the British Prime Minister, announcing the declaration of war from number 10 Downing Street. It's like a very, certainly in the UK, it's a very well-known speech.
Thinking that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received.
And consequently, this country is... So we've got the Winter War has just broken out, which is between the Soviet Union and Finland. Basically, the Soviets demanded a bunch of land from Finland. Finland refused, the Soviets invaded. Technically, it was a Soviet win. I mean, they did take territory. Finland eventually agreed to give up some of its land. But the Finns fought incredibly hard. The Soviets suffered massive casualties. I mean, it was a relatively short war, only lasted a few months. The Soviets suffered massive casualties. And it was a huge embarrassment for them. I mean, their army, which had been desecrated by Stalin's purges, was kind of shown to be completely incompetent. And of course, people in Berlin were watching this, and it exaggerated their view of Soviet weakness.
War with Germany.
Roosevelt verlangt endlich die Bereitwilligkeit, in die Zusicherung zu geben, dass die deutschen Streitkräfte das Staatsgebiet Polen nach unten ab.
Not sure who this is talking now, but he sounds really pissed off. He just needs a lozenge, doesn't he?
Nationen nicht angreifen und nennt Finnland, Lettland, Litauen, Estland, Norwegen, Schweden, Dänemark, Niederlande, Belgien, Großbritannien, Irland, Frankreich, Portugal, Spanien, die Schweiz, Liechtenstein, Luxemburg, Polen, Rumänien, Yugoslavia, Russland, Bulgaria, Turkey, Iraq, Arabia, Syria.
Yeah, so as you can see here, Finland has capitulated. But I mean, it cannot be overstated that the Finns fought incredibly hard. I mean, the Molotov cocktail, petrol bomb, was one of the kind of things they invented or used to take out Soviet tanks. Molotov, of course, being the Soviet Commissioner for Foreign Affairs and a key Stalin ally. Right, so this is the invasion of Denmark and Norway. I mean, this was kind of triggered by the Western Allies to some extent. So France and Britain were mining the waters around Norway and trying to interfere with German ships. The reason for that was they were trying to block off Swedish iron ore from Germany. I mean, Swedish iron ore was an absolutely crucial part of the German war economy. So the Allies thought if they could block that, they could do some real damage. And you know, obviously the Germans fought the same because they responded by invading Denmark, which surrendered, I think, within about a day, and surrendering and invading Norway, which fought very hard. I mean, the Norwegians managed to sink at least one quite big German warship. And British and French troops arrived in Norway as well. So it was a very bold operation for the Nazis. It could have gone quite badly wrong. But their navy in particular suffered very heavy losses against the Royal Navy. And of course, the Kriegsmarine was never anything like as big as the Royal Navy. So it was. I mean, they won, but their navy took a really big hit. You can kind of see that the Allies, the Norwegians, British, French, are being pushed back to eventually Narvik in the north was kind of their final stand before they evacuated. So this is the big offensive that kind of finally breaks the phony war. A German attack through the Ardennes, which is a very heavily forested region. The British and French didn't think the Germans would be able to get their panzer divisions through heavy armour, but they did. And they went also round via Netherlands and Belgium, knocking both of those out of the war in order to kind of get around the stronger French defences. It was a devastating attack.
Right in France.
And as you can see now, they've split off a big chunk of the Allied army, so that almost the entire British army and a chunk of the French army is now stuck in this pocket, which will eventually coalesce around Dunkirk, which cuts them off from the remainder of France.
We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air.
And as you can see here, so Italy joined the war very late. I mean, there's a famous quote from Mussolini. I can't remember the exact wording, but basically the gist of it is that he needs 10,000 dead Italians to justify a place at the peace table, as in a sort of a lot along with Hitler to discuss the dismembering of French territories.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on.
And at this point, France is kind of split in half. So the northern and western parts is under direct German occupation. The southern part is Vichy, which is a kind of fascist collaborator regime, and it's sympathetic to the Axis, not entirely part of it. But there was fighting between the Vichy regime and the British and the Free French, who were kind of the French who wanted to carry on fighting against the Nazis. I mean, there's a very controversial incident in which the Royal Navy sunk a big chunk of the French Navy in both France and particularly North Africa, killed a lot of people. And it's still very controversial to this day, although obviously the British were terrified that the French fleet would fall into German hands.
On the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender, and if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle.
So if we go down here, we can see the beginning of the conflict in North Africa. Basically, there's an Italian invasion from Libya into British-controlled Egypt, but it was a complete disaster. I mean, pretty much all of the Italian offensives in World War II were disasters to some extent.
Until in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old.
So, as I said, the Axis has now been formed with Imperial Japan. Obviously, we can't see this on this map, but Japan was already fighting against China. I mean, China was in a complete mess because it was kind of a civil war between nationalist and communist factions, and the Japanese were making huge progress and committing some really horrific atrocities. I mean, that began in 1937, actually. Arguably, so you could argue the Second World War began in 1937, but obviously that's not on this map, and I presume the whole Pacific theatre will not be either. Yeah. So again, this is another disastrous Italian offensive. They managed to occupy Albania relatively easily, but very small country. They tried to invade Greece, and it was just a catastrophe. Not only were they repulsed by the Greeks then advanced into Albania. And essentially Hitler had to bail out the Italians, both in North Africa and in Greece. I mean, it's a really interesting question as to why the Italian army performed so poorly. Was it low morale? They just really didn't want to fight for Mussolini. I mean, Mussolini made some terrible personal interventions, which certainly didn't help things. But it's a really interesting question. So you can see at this point the Greeks are pushing back the Italians in Albania, and the British are pushing back the Italians in Libya. This was kind of almost the blow that Mussolini's prestige never recovered from. I mean, he dreamed of rebuilding a kind of second Roman Empire based around Italy, and obviously he was getting his arse handed to him. And this is a really interesting point. So it said here, the Soviet Union offered to join the Axis. Imagine like what an alternative history would have been if the alliance between the USSR and Nazi Germany had never collapsed. I mean, arguably they were always going to fight at some point because their ideologies are so opposed to each other. But I mean, that is like a terrifying alternative history.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. All our hearts go out to the fighter pilots, whose brilliant actions we see with our own eyes day after day. I hope, indeed I pray, that we shall not be found unworthy of...
I mean, the reason that Egypt was so important, why the Italians were so keen to seize it, or in large part, was the Suez Canal. So if you seize the Suez Canal, it means that the Allies can't, or the British can't get ships between Britain and eastern parts of the empire and dominions, so particularly India, Australia, New Zealand, etc., without going round the Cape of Good Hope, going all the way around South Africa, which so strategically it would be a huge loss. Also by association, the kind of oil fields in Iraq would be very vulnerable.
Of our victory, if after toil and tribulation it is...
So we can just see in Yugoslavia, there was actually a coup in Yugoslavia. So Yugoslavia had been on the verge of joining the Axis. There was a sort of pro-Allied coup, and then the Germans invaded. And the country collapsed very quickly, partly because some of its kind of constituent nationalities wanted to fight, some didn't. In particular, a lot of Croats and some Bosnian Muslims would end up collaborating with the Nazi regime. The Serbs fought incredibly fierce, not so much during the initial invasion, but particularly in partisan warfare later. Both Serb nationalists and communists under Tito, and it was incredibly brutal. I mean, the partisan warfare in Eastern Europe, in Yugoslavia, in Greece, all across Poland, the USSR, makes kind of the French resistance and the Dutch resistance, etc., look incredibly tame by comparison. It was just brutality on a whole different scale.
Granted to us. For the rest, we have to gain the victory. That is our task.
Yeah, you see, there was very briefly a kind of pro-Axis movement in Iraq, and Britain invaded to secure the oil. Fundamentally, let's not beat around the bush. Right, so this is Operation Barbarossa, one of the biggest calamities in human history, certainly one of the biggest conflicts in human history. Huge numbers of troops on either side, absolutely brutal. Two kind of totalitarian superpowers going at it to the death. And an absolute catastrophe in terms of human life. And honestly, there's been, other than maybe some Chinese civil wars, I don't think there's been anything on its scale for in the rest of human history, to be honest. And you can see the Nazis are having these great victories. So they keep encircling hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. They're capturing huge numbers of them. And partly because the Red Army was a complete mess after Stalin's purges, partly because Stalin refused to accept there was going to be an invasion, even though there was quite a lot of intelligence. I mean, the British were saying there was going to be, but he didn't believe them. Even right before the attack, there was a German communist sympathizer who crossed over to the Soviet lines and said, we are about to attack you. And the Soviets assumed he was lying and shot him. Initially the Germans went absolutely hammer. And Stalin was very worried for a while that there was going to be a coup against him. I mean, he sort of slightly lost his marbles for a while. But obviously, eventually, the situation was stabilised. As you can see, Finland takes the opportunity to rejoin the war. Finland's a really interesting case because it's a democracy. It's really the only democracy that fought on the Axis side. So, obviously, Finland was fighting because it had its own grudge against the USSR because it had its land stolen. But it's a really interesting case of kind of ideologically diverse, extremely ideologically diverse countries allying together against a common enemy. So as you can see, it's just encirclement after encirclement. 100,000 Soviet troops captured, 200,000, 300,000 in his pockets. I think there was a big one on Kiev. It's again and again and again. So now you can see the Germans are getting really close to Moscow, scarily close. The other thing worth pointing out is Iran. So there was a joint British and Soviet operation to essentially take control of Iran. But that was very much more of a sideshow. So you can see just how close the Germans got to Moscow. Arguably, even if Moscow hadn't fallen, it might not have made that much difference. The Soviets did a really good job of moving their heavy industry to the east. Obviously, Moscow fell to Napoleon, and that didn't do him much good. But it certainly would have been a big symbolic blow if Moscow had fallen.
Yesterday, December 7th.
So this is Pearl Harbor, of course. And this was for the Western Allies, so for the people who were concerned about fighting for democracy rather than fighting for communism. This was the kind of decisive moment when fortunes turned. Churchill sort of said that this is the point where we won the war, basically. If the United States had not joined the war, or indeed if it had only joined the war against Japan, because Hitler actually declared war on Germany, Europe would probably have looked very, very different after World War II. It likely would have been almost completely Soviet dominated. Britain might have been almost a sort of a last redoubt of non-communist control in Europe. So yes, the entry of America was absolutely enormous.
1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Is it just me, or do politicians in this era just... They're just much more eloquent than some of our current politicians. Not all of obviously Roosevelt, but also Churchill, Chamberlain. These are strong speeches. I can't imagine much of what some of our contemporary politicians say be remembered in the same way in 70 years. Maybe I'm being unfair,
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
I mean, one very significant thing is that the Americans agreed with the UK, but they've focused on Europe first, despite the fact that Japan had obviously attacked at Pearl Harbor, not Germany. The Americans agreed that their priority would be on defeating the Nazis rather than the Japanese. And of course, going back to what I was saying earlier, had they not come to that view, and the Soviets would then have played a big role in defeating Nazi Germany, Europe would have looked very different after the war. I mean, of course, the Japanese were also attacking British possessions all across Asia. They were trying to take India, was the kind of one of the big targets. And the British had some absolute disasters around Singapore. They had some very famous warships sunk almost without loss. Just the sheer number of people involved in fighting on the Eastern Front is just insane. I mean, look, 5.5 million versus 3 million. I would say it wasn't just German troops. Obviously, there were Italians, but there were also Hungarians, Romanians, Bulgarians. There were Finns as part of kind of the Axis alliance. So, I mean, just the sheer scale is almost beyond comprehension. It was just a horrific engagement. Quite a controversial move. Hitler was very keen, rather than moving straight towards Moscow or Leningrad, he wanted to capture the Caucasus, essentially to try and capture the Russians' oil. Some of his generals really didn't agree with that. They wanted to go straight for Moscow. Obviously, Hitler overruled them, and they went with this plan for the Caucasus. And initially, quite successful, but in the long term, it didn't really work. And so this is about the time in Egypt where you got the Battle of El Alamein. Well, there was two battles of El Alamein. The first was when the Germans attacked, and then the second was when the British attacked. The second one being the key one in that, I mean, Churchill once said that basically, but before El Alamein, the Allies had almost nothing but defeats. After El Alamein, they had almost nothing but victories. And to be honest, that's kind of true. It was. I mean, obviously, it was more what was happening on the Eastern Front that was a real turning point. But there was definitely a lot of truth to that. And you can see here Leningrad, which is obviously modern day St. Petersburg, is just surrounded, and it suffered a horrendous siege. A huge number of civilians were killed, mostly starved to death. And it was incredibly. I mean, generally the war on the Eastern Front was incredibly brutal. Quite different to the Western Front, where generally there was some degree of respect between the British and the Americans and the French and the Germans. On the Eastern Front, there was no respect on either side, but both sides were kind of trying to exterminate the other. Now we've got the torch landings in North Africa. We also had Stalingrad, which is a huge German defeat. So as you can see, that there are simultaneous Allied attacks, so that the British are pushing in from Egypt into Libya, and simultaneously the Americans and some Brits as well launched an invasion of French North Africa, and eventually they kind of squeezed the Italians and Germans into Tunisia and then out of Africa altogether. it mentioned with Stalingrad, Goering was convinced that he could supply the Sixth Army in Stalingrad, even though it was kind of cut off and besieged. So the Germans launched a massive air operation to try and supply them, but it just didn't work. Goering lost a huge amount of prestige, and a huge number of Germans lost their lives. So this is heading into the Battle of Kursk, the biggest tank battle in world history. Was a kind of one of the Germans' last great offensives. I mean, the last point at which they still looked like they had a chance of actually possibly pulling it off. But it was a really, really nasty fight, and they were obviously halted by Soviet armour. So this is and this is very controversial. So both, not so much the Soviets. The Soviets did have a big air force. They mainly used it on the front, but the British and Americans did a huge amount of terror bombing of German cities. Of course, that's exactly what the Germans had done to the UK and to other countries. But definitely some of the targets they were hitting were not military targets. They were terror bombing German cities. So obviously that's morally quite complex. I mean, you could argue that it was okay because it shortened the Holocaust and the war, but also you could argue that it is war crime to deliberately target civilians. So go and argue about it in the comments section. So we can see the Allied invasion of Sicily. This leads on to, so this is a joint American and British operation, and that would lead on to the invasion of Italy as well. I mean, this was Churchill's kind of brainchild. He had this kind of obsession with finding like the soft underbelly of the Nazi Empire. Very similar to the First World War, where he organised the Dardanelles campaign, which led to the Gallipoli disaster against the Ottoman Empire. But yeah, I mean, I can understand his reasoning. Obviously, he could kind of see how much horrendous fighting there'd been on the Eastern Front and obviously on the Western Front during the First World War, and wanted like a quick way to avoid it. But it didn't really work, and it probably did delay the D-Day landings in France by a bit. Yeah, so Italy, essentially a kind of coup in Italy, led by, well, actually kind of orchestrated around the king. And that then provoked the German invasion. The Germans did really well to manage to get almost all the way down to the bottom of Italy and overwhelm the Italians without that much fighting. And then there was a kind of, from that point on, there was a really nasty but very slow kind of war of attrition up Italy, in which, generally speaking, the Allies were held to quite a slow rate of advance. Okay, so this is a key point. The Soviets are crossing the Dnieper River, which is in the middle of modern-day Ukraine. Very sadly, it is once again a conflict zone. But yeah, this is a kind of key point in their taking back of their territories and then going on to invade the Axis territories. It is worth remembering. So the the war against Nazi Germany was primarily won on the Eastern Front. That's just a fact. That the Soviet Union did the lion's share of the fighting. It is worth remembering, though, that the Soviet Union had a huge amount of supplies and economic support, particularly from the United States and to a certain extent from Britain, which definitely made a really big difference. So, I mean, the USA is a kind of the economic might of the USA was incredible, and that had an absolutely decisive impact on the war. Right, so as we can see, the Soviets are making just enormous gains. And I mean, I know I keep saying this, but the level of brutality on both sides on the Eastern Front can't be overstated. They've now entered Romania, which is one of the Axis powers. So some of Germany's allies in Eastern Europe start getting knocked out.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you.
Right, so this, of course, is D-Day. So that voice was Eisenhower, the American general who was the supreme Allied commander, or Allied being American, British, Commonwealth. So they did a major landing in Normandy. They kind of persuaded the Germans it was going to be near Calais. And it was a bold operation. It could have failed, but they managed to gain a beachhead. And once they had the beachhead, they really had the numbers and industrial muscle to make their push forward pretty inevitable.
The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world.
So as you can see now, the Germans are being decisively pushed back on every front, on the Eastern Front in particular, but also in Normandy and in Italy. They completely lost in Africa. I mean, by this point, it was pretty clear that they'd lost the war. And like a sensible leader would have tried to negotiate some sort of settlement at this point. Obviously, Hitler turned out to be a lunatic. Well, not turned out to be. Hitler was a lunatic. The other interesting thing, which I probably should have brought up earlier, is Spain. So both the Italians and the Germans were very keen to get Spain to join the war on their side. Obviously, Spain had a fascist government, and both Italy and Germany had played a big role in that fascist government winning the Spanish Civil War. So they kind of felt that it was Franco's turn to pay up. But Franco just flat out refused, he made unrealistic territorial demands. And Hitler, there's a famous quote by Hitler, was something along the lines of he'd rather go and have one of his teeth pulled out than go and have another meeting with Franco, which tells you a bit about the man. But yeah, no, Franco very sensibly kept Spain out of the war, because otherwise, otherwise it would have been attacked. Yeah, so there was another big landing, predominantly American, in the south of France. So by this point, German resistance in France was already crumbling. They were making huge progress in the north, and the southern landing wasn't unopposed, but it was relatively lightly opposed, and it was very effective. So you can see at this point the Soviets have just reached Warsaw. Before the Soviets reached Warsaw, there was a huge rebellion by the Polish resistance, the Polish Home Army, I think they were called. And I mean, they managed to capture much of Warsaw, and then the Germans recaptured it using heavy artillery, bombing, etc. Notably, the Soviets held back and basically let the Nazis kill the Polish Home Army. Obviously, Stalin wanted Poland to be a subservient state to the USSR after the war, so it was in his interests for the kind of the Polish resistance, the Polish troops, to be killed by the Nazis. The British and Americans tried to help a bit with airdrops, but fundamentally there was very little they could do, and the Soviets just flat out refused to have British and American planes dropping supplies to the Poles from their territory. So it was an incredibly sort of Machiavellian tactic that Stalin used to kind of to crush any Polish resistance. Also, I missed the Battle of the Ardennes, which is an attempt by the Germans to kind of replicate their 1940 victory against France with another attack through the Ardennes region. The Battle of the Bulge is often called, but they were forced back predominantly by American troops. They had some initial kind of slight wins. They managed to isolate a big group of American troops, but the Americans never surrendered, and they eventually pushed them back. Oh yeah, this is the Battle of the Bulge. Sorry, I was getting ahead of myself. So even little things which are quite easy to miss. So for example, the Western Allies, particularly Britain, launched an attack on, or a liberation of Greece. And of course, that would have a huge impact on the post-war settlement. So Greece stayed within the kind of the Western sphere of influence. Had the British not liberated Greece, had the Soviets done it instead, Greece almost certainly would have been another communist puppet state. There was a very brief Greek civil war after World War II, in which the British helped the Greek anti-communists defeat the communists, and remarkably, the Soviets largely stayed out of it. So at this point, Germany is clearly screwed. I mean, the Western Allies have taken the Ruhr, which is the kind of the base of German heavy industry. They clearly should surrender. It's just the madness of kind of the Nazis. I suppose the knowledge that their crimes are so terrible they were never going to get away with it, that meant the war went on. Right, so that is it. Obviously, this is the Nazi surrender. Japan would last a bit longer until, well, it was kind of the twin shocks of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion pushed Japan out of the war. I mean, what is interesting here is you can see how the kind of the lines where the armies met is pretty much where the Cold War divide remained for, I don't know, a good 40, 50 years. With the exception of Yugoslavia, which kind of went its own way a little bit. I mean, it was communist, but it was not pro-Moscow under Tito. But other than that, where the armies ended up is pretty much where the Cold War divide happened. But anyway, I hope you found that interesting. Christopher, thank you for your video. It was obviously link in the description. Please go and subscribe. Maybe subscribe to me. I wouldn't complain. It was a long one, wasn't it? I probably talked too much, but thank you very much and hope to see you for the next one.